Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you all here today as we celebrate Law Day, a day in which we pause to reflect on the significance of the rule of law for our country and our society, and I dare say the world. Recently, at a conference that I attended, Vice President Biden addressed the group, and in his comments he started talking about American exceptionalism. And what he said was that there's a lot of that term is bandied around, and there are other democracies in the world that operate as well, if not better than ours, and there are a number of countries who have economic systems that are more robust than ours, especially now. But he said when they talk about American exceptionalism, what people are really talking about is our adherence to and our respect for the rule of law. It is unparalleled in the world, and it's what makes America the great country that it is. And our capital, the nation's capital, has played a pivotal role in preserving, protecting, and enforcing the rule of law. And it's interesting that this year, that role as a protector and a defender and a promoter of equal access to justice as a part of our rule, as part of the essence of the rule of law, is being recognized. The theme, as you know, for this Law Day is realizing the dream, equality for all. And I can't think of a more appropriate place to address that topic than here next to two landmarks that speak to our quest for equality for all. The historic Courthouse of the District of Columbia, and of course the Lincoln statue commemorating President Abraham Lincoln, and of course all he did to promote equality for all in this country. First built in 1820, this courthouse has been the site of many historic events, including the trial of Daniel Drayton, an abolitionist who organized the largest attempted mass escape of slaves in U.S. history, and the appointment of Frederick Douglass, a former slave turned abolitionist, as the U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia. It was also in this building that President Abraham Lincoln signed the D.C. Compensated Emancipation Act of 1862, ending slavery in Washington, D.C., just prior to his decision to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. I think it was 8 months later. The statue behind you was the first public monument for Abraham Lincoln. I have that on information and belief, although there are Lincolnophiles and historians who question it. I believe it. It was built 3 years after Lincoln's assassination, and it was funded by public funds raised by the citizens of the District of Columbia. And it's funny, it's interesting, not funny, but interesting that the unveiling ceremony of the statue, and there's a picture of it captured downstairs in the museum portion of the historic library, has about 20,000 people who came to dedicate that statue, and at the time that was about a fifth of the entire population of the District of Columbia. Standing here today, we recognize these historic landmarks of our nation's history and others. The Lincoln Memorial, where Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech, is one, and as we know, the nation is celebrating the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington this year. The nation is also celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, the 100th anniversary of the Women's Suffrage March, and the 50th anniversary of the Supreme Court's Gideon decision safeguarding the right to counsel, an issue we explored in our judicial conference just last week. I'm thrilled to have you join with us today to celebrate Law Day, and once again to welcome you to this Law Day event. And now, to continue in our commemoration of this day and to celebrate this issue, please join me in welcoming Deborah Swingon-Stokes from the D.C. courts, who will be favoring us with a song. Deborah?
Before I be a slave, I'd rather be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. No more mourning, no more mourning, no more mourning over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. No more crying, no more crying, no more crying over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. They'll be singing, they'll be singing, they'll be singing over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
To help us celebrate Law Day today, we have invited Mr. Harry Jones as our guest speaker. Mr. Jones is the Assistant Director and Curator of the African American Civil War Freedom Foundation and Museum in Washington, D.C., and is one of the foremost authorities on the role of African Americans in the Civil War. Mr. Jones served in the United States Marine Corps for over 20 years and retired as a captain in 1997. Since then, he has been conducting extensive research on African American military history, through American service throughout American history. He has appeared on the History Channel's Gettysburg documentary, PBS's American Lives 2 with Henry Louis Gates, and The History Detectives. He's the author of historical research that seeks to reveal the perspectives of the African descent freedom fighters who participated in the Civil War. In addition to his work at the African American Civil War Museum, Mr. Jones has worked on exhibits that are currently on display across the country. Mr. Jones recently favored us by speaking at our Black History Month event at the courts, which was well attended and very well received. In fact, I dare say to rave reviews. And we are delighted that he could join us once more on Law Day to bring what I think is a very powerful message about the role of African Americans in the Civil War and the involvement in the process of reconciliation. Mr. Jones.
Good afternoon, and yes, it's true, I spent 21 years in the Marine Corps. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall described the Constitution as a living document. He wrote, quote, "We the people are no longer enslaved, but the credit does not belong to the framers. It belongs to those who refuse to acquiesce to the outdated notions of liberty, justice, and equality, and who strived to better them, close quote. Those who strive to better those notions of justice, liberty, and equality were true patriots. Martin Delany, in an essay in the North Star, December 1848, described a true patriot as one who is willing to sacrifice for the achievement of liberty, justice, and equality under the law for all in the body politic. Delany said, true patriotism is not about a blind allegiance to your country. Jingoism isn't true patriotism. But true patriotism is one who is willing to ensure that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is for all in the body politic. Martin Delany represents those true patriots to whom the credit belongs. However, in American history, whenever Martin Delany comes up in our courses, we have often taught that he was a black nationalist who sought to leave the United States. I ask that we pay closer attention to the writings of Martin Delany, one of the leaders of an African-American secret society that would seek to end the tyranny of slavery and gain their rights as citizens. Allen Pinkerton, the famed railroad detective and head of Union intelligence in the first year of the war, observed, quote, although as yet prevented from taking up arms in defense of their rights, these colored men had banded themselves together to further the cause of freedom, close quote. Pinkerton would refer to these colored men, or more appropriately, these men and women of African descent who had banded themselves together to further the cause of freedom, as members of a national organization, a secret organization called the Loyal League. It was also known as the Legal League, and it was known as Lincoln's Legal Loyal League, or the 4 L's. This secret African-American organization would provide the most prolific recruiters of African Americans for the Union war effort. This secret African-American organization would become the single most important source of tactical and strategic intelligence during the Civil War. This secret African-American organization had as its express goal to end the tyranny of slavery in league with the Constitution. Indeed, they would breathe into the Constitution life. They would make it a living document. They would be true patriots who in league with the Constitution would indeed end the tyranny of slavery and gain their rights as citizens. But again, when we talk about Martin Delany, he's often described as a black nationalist, not a true patriot. In that essay in December of 1848, Delany wrote, quote, but the time shall yet come when the despised, neglected American patriot, in spite of American prejudice, shall rise superior to the spirit that would degrade it and find its place on the records of merit and fame. Close quote. Well, the time has come for us to tell the story of these true American patriots who in league with the Constitution would end the tyranny of slavery and gain their rights as citizens. Delany, again, is described as a black nationalist who wanted to leave the United States. He would write in 1852 in a book on immigration and the elevation of the colored people of the United States, quote, we are Americans having a birthright citizenship, natural claims upon the country, claims common to all our fellow citizens, natural rights, which may by unjust laws be obstructed, but can never be annulled, close quote. Delany believed that our citizenship was a birthright. And in 1854, Martin Delany and William Howard Day would organize a meeting in Cleveland, Ohio, Often contemporary scholars refer to this meeting as evidence that Delaney was a black nationalist who wanted to leave the United States because the name of the convention was the Negro Immigration Convention. So it seems quite obvious that they wanted to leave the United States. Also, it is important to note that they were planning for what they believed was going to be a civil war that they believed was going to give them a genuine opportunity to strike a blow for liberty, and there were enemies to their cause. So of course they were not going to call a convention and say, these are the Negroes seeking to end slavery in league with the Constitution, and we're going to be very open about this, Mr. Planter down in the South. In fact, they created a ruse that many contemporary scholars still fall for. But if we go to Delaney and pay close attention to it, but more importantly, if we go to William Howard Day, William Howard Day was noted in the African American community in the 1850s as one who took a strong stand, believing that the Constitution could indeed be used to end the tyranny of slavery. In 1851, in a convention in Columbus, Ohio, Hezekiah Ford Douglass, an eloquent orator, originally from Virginia, who had escaped and attended Oberlin Preparatory School in Oberlin, Ohio, rose in this meeting in Columbus, and he introduced a resolution renouncing the Constitution as, quote, a guilty compromise with slavery in order to form the Union, close quote. Hezekiah Ford Douglass, no relation to Frederick Douglass. It's one S on the end of his Douglass, not two. Hezekiah Ford Douglass would cite all the egregious acts of presidents, legislators, and justices as evidence that you should renounce the Constitution of the United States. William Howard Day, born in New York City, an 1847 graduate of Oberlin College, rose and he said, Mr. Douglass is confusing the Constitution with the men who are implementing it. That's like confusing your Bible with preachers who sin. We're not going to throw away our Bible because preachers sin, and we're not going to throw away the Constitution because of the frailties of these men. And Day declared, I consider the Constitution the foundation of American liberties, and wrapping myself in the flag of the nation, I would plant myself upon that Constitution, and using the weapons they have given me, I would appeal to the American people for the rights thus guaranteed, close quote. And at a vote of 28-2, William Howard Day won the day that day in Columbus. And the young radicals had agreed that in league with the Constitution, they were going to end the tyranny of slavery. So it is with William Howard Day and Martin Delaney, they organized a Negro Immigration Convention in Cleveland, Ohio in August of 1854. And again, we often speak of these are the Negroes that want to leave the United States, but let's look to their declaration of sentiments to understand what they were really about. In Declaration number 12, they wrote, quote, that as men and equals, we demand every political right, privilege, and position which white men have in the United States, close quote. Notice in the United States doesn't sound like they really want to go anywhere. Indeed, where they go is to Chatham, Canada West, 50 miles from Detroit, not very far from the United States, where they're safe from the slave hunters and the U.S. Marshals at this time after the Fugitive Slave Act. They're safe from the Marshals, they're safe from raids, they're safe from the planters, and there they organize themselves militarily, preparing for a genuine opportunity to strike a blow for liberty, as evidence that they were clearly preparing for a civil war. We can listen to their language. One of the most eloquent speakers in the African American community in the late 1850s, one of those most eloquent intellectuals, was Dr. John S. Rock. Dr. John S. Rock was born in Salem, New Jersey in 1825. Dr. Rock was an 1852 graduate of the American Medical College in Philadelphia. Dr. Rock was a physician, a dentist, a school teacher, and the first African American lawyer to be admitted to the bar of the U.S. Supreme Court. Dr. Rock gave a speech in Boston on March 5th, 1858. Now, this was also the one-year anniversary of the Dred Scott decision. March 5th, 1857. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney would write in the majority opinion that Negroes were being so inferior that they had no rights that white men were bound to respect. argued that the framers had no intention of including Negroes as citizens. Now, the irony of this decision on March 5th, 1857, is that is the anniversary of the Boston Massacre. March 5th, 1770, Crispus Attucks, a man of African descent, was the first to lose his life in what became the American Revolution. On March 5th, 1858, Dr. Rock would say, quote, Judge Taney has tried to outlaw the black man, but the black man will outlive Judge Taney, close quote. Indeed, Dr. Rock, like Martin Delany, believed that their citizenship was a birthright. In this speech delivered by Dr. Rock in Boston 3 years, 1 month, and 8 days before the Civil War begins, Dr. Rock said, and I quote, sooner or later the clashing of arms will be heard in this country, and the black man's services will be needed. 150,000 freemen capable of bearing arms, and not all cowards and fools, and 750,000 slaves wild with the enthusiasm caused by the dawn of the glorious opportunity of being able to strike a genuine blow for freedom will be a power which the white man will be bound to respect. Will the blacks fight? Of course they will, close quote. 3 years before the Civil War begins, America's African descent population is preparing for what they believe will be a genuine opportunity to end the tyranny of slavery and to gain their rights as citizens. When the Civil War began on April 12, 1861, with the firing on Fort Sumter, Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, there were nearly 4 million Americans of African descent claimed as property, held as slaves. And African Americans could not answer Lincoln's call for soldiers in April of 1861 because it was illegal for African Americans to join the Federal Army in 1861. It had been illegal since 1792, just months after the Haitian Revolution began. Congress passed the United States Volunteer Militia Act of 1792, which restricted enlistment into the Federal Army and to the Federal Militia to, quote, able-bodied white males, close quote, a reaction to the Haitian Revolution. President George Washington, when he signed that legislation into law, understood that the French had trained those African descent revolutionaries down in Haiti. And so the United States did not want to make the same mistake. So when the Civil War begins in April of 1861, it is not legal for men of African descent to join the Federal Army. That's why Pinkerton would write, although prevented from taking up arms in defense of their rights, it was in the interest of African Americans to get these laws changed. It was in the interest of the Loyal League to get the laws changed. And they understood Abraham Lincoln as their ally in the attempts to make the Civil War as a war to end the tyranny of slavery. They understood Lincoln as their ally. Now, you might have contemporary scholars that will talk about Lincoln waffling, Lincoln not really wanting to do that. But if you read Dr. John S. Rock, if you read Dr. Martin Delany, later to be a major commissioned by President Lincoln, it is very clear that they had confidence in Lincoln. But one of the clearest evidence of that is an article written in August of 1861 by Frederick Douglass. It appeared in his monthly, August 1861, in which Douglass says, quote, we have very good evidence to the fact, close quote. And I want to point out that in this article, Douglass italicizes, we have very good evidence to the fact that the Lincoln administration, the administration in Washington, notwithstanding appearances, stands ready to enforce a policy in the rebellious states that will eventually abolish slavery in those rebellious states, quote, just as soon as the people require it, close quote. Now, what does Douglass mean by as soon as the people require it? Well, the voice of the people in our federal government is Congress. As soon as Congress requires it. Douglass would go on in his article to encourage his readers to lobby Congress, send petitions to your congressman. Go to Washington if you can, meet with your congressman to get the laws changed. Douglass, Lincoln, and the members of the Loyal League, of Lincoln's Legal Loyal League, they understood that Congress would not change these laws until it became an indispensable military necessity. Or in other words, when the majority in Congress understood that emancipation must become a part of the federal policy in the Civil War in order to get African Americans on the Union side. So the question is, when did the majority in Congress understand that it was absolutely necessary to change these laws? Well, in the spring of 1862, Union General George McClellan had assembled arguably the best trained and best equipped army in the world. It was certainly the largest army in the Western Hemisphere. McClellan trained his army here in the Washington area. He took his army down to the Virginia Peninsula, marched it up the Virginia Peninsula, and by the first day of June 1862, McClellan's army, the largest army in the Western Hemisphere, was within 10 miles of the rebel capital. On that same day, June 1st, 1862, General Robert E. Lee took command of the rebel forces, the Confederate forces, in defense of Richmond. General Lee's army was less than half the size of McClellan's army. But Lee was able to deceive McClellan into believing that his army was 4 times its actual size. Lee was able to deceive McClellan into believing that wooden cannons, often referred to as Quaker guns, were indeed real cannons. Now, they were called Quaker guns because they were ultimately peaceful or friendly guns. They were simply logs and could not fire anything. But Lee was able to deceive McClellan into believing they were real cannons. How was Lee able to deceive McClellan? Well, let's examine what we do know. Allen Pinkerton was the head of Union intelligence during the Peninsula Campaign. Allen Pinkerton was almost wholly dependent on the Loyal League operative John Scoble for his information, and the Loyal League understood that if McClellan captures Richmond in the spring or early summer of 1862, emancipation will never be tabled. The war would not become a war for emancipation. Indeed, Senator Willard Salisbury of Delaware is very conscious of what's going on, and he would say on the floor of the Senate on June 24th, 1862, that you Republicans have a scheme for making this war a war for emancipation. Certainly, the Loyal League, Lincoln's legal Loyal League, had a scheme, and a part of that scheme is they misinformed McClellan. Lee was able to deceive and outmaneuver McClellan. And in the first week of July 1862, word gets here to Washington that McClellan's army, the largest army in the Western Hemisphere, was in full retreat, suffering a humiliating defeat. And later that July, Congress would pass the Militia Act of 1862, granting President Lincoln the authority to employ persons of African descent in any military capacity for which he saw fit. This legislation, born of military necessity, was on President Lincoln's desk for signature on July 17, 1862. Another important piece of legislation was on President Lincoln's desk that day. It is referred to as the Second Confiscation Act. And in Section 6 of the Second Confiscation Act, Congress gave the president the authority to seize, to confiscate, to take all property of persons in states in rebellion. Now, those held as slaves were claimed as property. President Lincoln is being given the authority by Congress to confiscate, to take all slaves in states in rebellion. In Section 9 of the Second Confiscation Act, Congress declared forever free all persons held as slaves by supporters of the rebellion. President Lincoln signed both these pieces of legislation into law on the 17th of July, 1862. He then had the legal authority to bring men of African descent into the federal army and to declare free slaves in states in rebellion. 5 days later, July 22nd, 1862, Lincoln met with his cabinet. He informed his cabinet members that he was ready to issue an Emancipation Proclamation immediately, acting on the authority that Congress had given him. He gave a draft of his proclamation to his cabinet members and asked for their advice. One of his cabinet members, Secretary of State William Seward, advised President Lincoln not to issue the Emancipation Proclamation at that time in July of 1862. Secretary Seward was an abolitionist out of New York. He supported universal emancipation. Yet he is advising President Lincoln in July of 1862 not to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Why? Well, congressional elections were coming up. And Secretary Seward tells the president, we've just suffered the greatest disasters of the war. And if you issue this proclamation now, after those humiliating defeats, quote, it will be viewed in the mind of the people as the last measure of an exhausted government, a cry for help, the government stretching out its hands unto Ethiopia instead of Ethiopia stretching out her hands unto the government, close quote. Secretary Seward goes on to advise the president to wait for a military success, a victory on the battlefield that would mask, that would hide this cry for help to African Americans. President Lincoln, calling the proclamation a practical war measure, considered Secretary Seward's advice wise advice. Now, a prudent president takes wise advice. Lincoln waited to claim his victory. He would claim his victory on the bloodiest day in American history. Not the bloodiest battle in American history, but the bloodiest day in American history. September 17th, 1862, a battle about 85 miles northwest of Washington, near Sharpsburg, Maryland. Officially, it is called the Battle of Antietam. In 12 hours, 22,000 casualties. Well over half of those 22,000 casualties were Union soldiers, Lincoln soldiers, but the rebels under Robert E. Lee withdrew from the battlefield. So the Union Army under George McClellan claimed a victory. And 5 days later, September 22nd, 1862, with his victory in hand, President Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, in which he warned the states in rebellion that if they did not lay down their arms and return to the Union in the next 100 days, he was going to declare free their slaves on January 1, 1863. Well, the rebels did not believe that Lincoln and the Union Army could make good this threat because they believed they were winning the war. They called the Battle of Antietam the Battle of Sharpsburg and a draw, not a defeat. Viewed as a part of a larger military campaign where General Lee's army under Stonewall Jackson, General Thomas J. Jackson, had captured Harper's Ferry. If you have a victory in a tie, you'd call it a victory, and that's exactly what the Confederacy did. But the Northern press focused exclusively on that battle in Sharpsburg, calling it the Battle of Antietam and a Union victory, giving President Lincoln, more specifically, the Republican candidates in the 1862 congressional elections some political cover. And I do want to point out that President Lincoln's party, the Republican Party, even though it lost 21 seats in the House of Representatives, the 21 votes that they would need to pass the 13th Amendment, they would retain the majority in the House and in the Senate in the 1862 congressional elections. So the decision by President Lincoln to wait for a military success before issuing his Emancipation Proclamation is not evidence of him waffling on emancipation. It is evidence of his political prudence. It was indeed a prudent political decision to wait. In October of 1862, Frederick Douglass would write in his monthly that in order for the Emancipation Proclamation to be meaningful, in order for it to free any slaves, two conditions had to be met. The first condition was that the states in rebellion still had to be in rebellion as of January 1, 1863. And the second condition was that the rebellion had to be suppressed. In late 1862, African Americans are not watching for, waiting for a day of Jubilee, January 1, 1863, when the slaves would be set free. That is not what they were watching for. They were watching for that day of Jubilee when it would become legal for them to strike a blow for liberty. The goal of Lincoln's Legal Loyal League was to end the tyranny of slavery and league with the Constitution. So the Emancipation Proclamation was reason for Jubilee, not because it was going to free the slaves, but it was reason for Jubilee because now, by law, they could free themselves while helping to save the Union. President Lincoln issued the final Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863 as, quote, a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, close quote. I want you to pay close attention to the president's language within the Emancipation Proclamation. He did not pretend that this was simply a moral or humanitarian document. He was explicit, he was clear. He called it a fit and necessary war measure for what? For preserving the Union, for accomplishing the paramount objective of the war. Lincoln would even write in the Emancipation Proclamation that it was, quote, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, close quote. We need not be confused as to the purpose of this proclamation. It was indeed issued as a practical war measure. But it was also in line with the goals of Lincoln's Legal Loyal League, in line with the goals of those true patriots, and they would answer this call. And one of the clearest evidence of them being difference makers in the war is in May of 1863. General Robert E. Lee would write his head of counterintelligence, and he would tell him, quote, the chief source of information to our enemy comes through our Negroes, close quote. Now, Lee had a problem stopping what he knew was a security leak, because Lee had no idea that the Loyal League, Lincoln's Legal Loyal League, was well organized and they had intelligent men in it. Lee had a problem what I often refer to as racial oversight. He could not see the genius of these men and women of African descent, so he would tell his counterintelligence officer, quote, they can be easily deceived with proper precaution, close quote. So he goes into his Gettysburg campaign in 1863, in the spring of 1863, thinking that these Negroes can be easily deceived while they are deceiving him clearly, because George Meade, actually Joseph Hooker, General Hooker would know about what Lee was doing from African-American operatives like Charlie Wright, who informed John McGinty, Captain John McGinty, the field officer of the BMI, the Bureau of Military Information, in June of 1863 of the operations of Lee's army. And Captain McGinty reports that Charlie Wright was a walking order of battle. He knew all about Lee's army. And after the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863, it is very clear that George Meade, the Union commander, knew more about Lee's army than Lee did. Difference makers. A year earlier, Lee was able to deceive McClellan. Lee could no longer deceive the Union army because Lincoln's Legal Loyal League was at work. They would work, and Lincoln is aggressive in encouraging his generals to raise colored troops. He would send a letter to the governor of Tennessee, the military governor of Tennessee, Andrew Johnson, and he would tell Governor Johnson that I've heard rumors that you are interested in raising a Negro force. I want you to go through with that. And he tells Governor Johnson that the mere sight of 50,000 armed and trained black men on the Mississippi River will open that river up and bring this contest to an end sooner than later. Lincoln was also right General Grant, and he tells General Grant, you know, I've sent the adjutant general of the army down to the Mississippi Valley. That's Lorenzo Thomas. This is the kind of emphasis that Lincoln put on recruiting colored troops in the Mississippi. He sent the adjutant general to tell everybody to get out of the way. I'm going to recruit them. We're going to bring them into the army. And he tells Grant, I want you to help in this policy. Grant writes him back, August 1863, and he tells him, even if I did not agree with the policy, I would support the policy because I'm a good general and I follow orders. But he goes on to say, but I do agree with the policy. And Grant tells the president, August 1863, quote, by arming the Negro, we have added a powerful ally, close quote. I want you to appreciate the general's language. He did not say by freeing the Negro. He said by arming. And he did not say we simply added more bodies to our army. You might hear that from the contemporary scholars of today, but that is not what the general said. The general said we added what? A powerful ally. Difference makers on the battlefield. Indeed, Grant had captured Vicksburg, Mississippi on July 4th, 1863 with the help of African-American soldiers, sailors, guides, scouts, and spies. And he told Lincoln that Vicksburg could not have been captured when it was without the help of these African-Americans. Lincoln would go on to tell Congress in his message in December 1861 that my emancipation policy is working and that the employment of black soldiers is working. He says that the evidence of this is that the entire Mississippi has been opened up. We've split the rebel territory in two parts with little or no communication between the two parts. And he goes on to say that these black soldiers have demonstrated they make as good as soldiers as any. Attached to Lincoln's message to Congress in December of 1863 is a report, the annual report from the War Department, written by Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. In that report, Secretary Stanton tells Congress, quote, the slave has proven his manhood, close quote. I want you to appreciate what he said. He said, the slave has proven his manhood. And he said he's demonstrated that he made a good infantryman. He cited battles like Milliken's Bend in Louisiana, Port Hudson in Louisiana, Fort Wagner in South Carolina, as evidence that he made a good infantryman. He said that we've always known that they made good artillerymen by their service in the Navy. And he said, we also now know that they make good cavalrymen. And he cited a skirmish in Mississippi where the 1st Mississippi Cavalry of African descent was outnumbered by the rebels, and they defeated them. And this was cited in the official report as evidence that the Negro also made a good cavalryman. Indeed, Lincoln argued that his emancipation policy was working, and his emancipation policy indeed was working. Lincoln's Legal Loyal League was the single most important source of tactical and strategic intelligence during the Civil War. It was the members of Lincoln's Legal Loyal League, or as Martin Delany described it, that part of the Underground Railroad known only unto ourselves, that would provide the most prolific recruiters. And even when the Confederacy realized how good African Americans were at playing football, yes, I said that as my analogy, because in late 1864, the governor of Louisiana, Henry Miller, would write a letter to the Secretary of War of the Confederacy, James Seddon, and he'd tell Secretary Seddon that the time has come for us to bring every able-bodied Negro into our army. And he goes on to tell him, quote, "We have learned from dear-bought experience that Negroes can be taught to fight," close quote. Now, what is he saying? He says, I don't need a discussion on whether Negroes can fight or not. They've been whipping us out here. We have learned from dear-bought experience that Negroes can be taught to fight. That's like when Bear Bryant tells the governor of Alabama, after George Wallace refuses to allow those students to enroll, register at the University of Alabama, and that Saturday afternoon in Tuscaloosa, Sam the Bam Cunningham with the USC Trojans, Sam the Bam Cunningham's Randall Cunningham's older brother, Sam the Bam Cunningham ran all over Alabama, over 230 yards, 3 touchdowns. Very next day, what is Bear Bryant telling George Wallace? We've learned from dear-bought experience that Negroes can play football. And we know what Alabama's football team looked like now. Well, the Confederacy was moving in that direction because they had learned from dear-bought experience. African Americans have been winning battle after battle, capturing Confederate territory. And so in February of 1865, Martin Delany would come here to Washington to speak to President Lincoln. He would tell President Lincoln that that part of the Underground Railroad, known only unto ourselves, can prevent enlistment into the Confederacy. But in order for the leadership to be most effective, the federal government must show its good faith by assigning the leaders positions commensurate to our abilities. Delany proceeded to hand letters of recommendations to President Lincoln. President Lincoln told him, I don't need any letters of recommendation from you. I know all about you. And Lincoln proceeded to order Secretary of War Edwin Stanton to commission Martin Delany as a major of infantry in the U.S. Army Regulars. This is a significant commission. Commensurate to our abilities, what did Lincoln think of the Loyal League? What did Lincoln think of Martin Delany? He gave him a major's commission in the U.S. Army Regulars. There were 151 African-American commissioned officers who served during the Civil War. 150 of them were in the U.S. Army Volunteers. Only one, Martin Delany, was in the U.S. Army Regulars. And to give you a sense of how important that commission was, George Custer, in February of 1865, was a brigadier general in the U.S. Army Volunteers and a captain in the U.S. Army Regulars. Most regular officers were West Point graduates. Commensurate to our abilities, indeed, Lincoln recognized how important the Loyal League was in winning this war. African American soldiers would earn an enviable reputation in the Civil War. They would capture Charleston, South Carolina, February 18th, 1865. They would capture Richmond, Virginia, April 3rd, 1865. They would stop Robert E. Lee's army at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia on April 9th, 1865, and they would chase the governor of Texas and 10,000 Confederate soldiers out of the United States into Mexico in the early morning of June 15th, 1865. So if you ever celebrate Juneteenth, I want you to appreciate that you are not celebrating when the word got to Texas. You are celebrating when these conquering soldiers brought Texas back in the Union by force, enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation, therefore becoming the liberators, the emancipators of themselves and their own families. They would breathe air into that living document called the Constitution. These are American patriots, true patriots, and their story is an American story, not a story of black nationalists, not a story simply of African Americans, but a story of those to whom the credit belongs. Those that Justice Marshall identified as bringing us to a nation where liberty, equality, and justice can indeed be for all. We can realize this dream because of these true American patriots. Thank you.
Wow, Mr. Jones. Don't want to follow you, but want to thank you once again for joining us to share another amazing chapter of Black history, American history, and of course, DC history. You are truly a compelling, engaging speaker, which I think we all wish we had when we were in school, learning history. And thank you so much for the history that you bring us today. We much appreciate it. As you know, today is Law Day, and each year we think about the importance of the rule of law in this country and the numerous rights and freedoms we enjoy as a result of it and as a result of our Constitution. This year's Law Day theme, as chosen by the American Bar Association, is Realizing the Dream, Equality for All. So as we sit out here outside of this building, nearly 200 years old, beside a statue nearly 150 years old, and just a dozen or so blocks away from the Lincoln Memorial that honors Lincoln, President Lincoln, and that will forever be known as the backdrop for the Dr. Martin Luther King's immortal I Have a Dream speech. We must think of just how far we as a city, a society, a country have come since this building and this statue were built, but yet remember that there's plenty of work to be done. But I think we can take a moment this day to recommit ourselves to that elusive goal of equality for all. And before I conclude this celebration, I'd like just to take a moment to thank a couple of people, starting with Anita Jarman of our executive office, who planned this event. Ms. Jarman hasn't been with us very long, but she's made an impact, and we're pleased today to have her mother join us in the audience. Thank you. Thank you for coming. And of course, all the folk who set up the cheers, the audio, and all of you for presenting this to us and enabling us to bring up somebody like Mr. Jones to speak to us today. So with that, this concludes this year's Law Day 2013 celebration. Thank all of you for being here this afternoon. Have a great rest of the day.